on a cold, bustling street corner in Cleveland. A homeless man named Leonard, with nothing but a cardboard sign and the hope for $1, never expected that his life would change in the most surprising way. But when a young man in pristine white sneakers approached him, their brief encounter sparked something that would not only alter their lives, but also ignite a movement that no one saw coming. Before we dive into this shocking and heartwarming story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so you never miss a moment of inspiration. Trust me, you'll want to hear what happens next. Cleveland, Ohio, was alive with the bustling sounds of a busy city. The streets were filled with honking cars, hurried pedestrians, and the endless hum of conversation. On the corner of Broad Street and 17th Avenue, near an old convenience store, a man sat slumped against the wall, his eyes tired and dull, a world of hardship reflected in his weathered face. Leonard, 42 years old, had been living on the streets for nearly a year. It wasn't just the harsh winter winds that chilled him. It was the weight of a life that had been stripped away by a series of unfortunate events. A lost job after the local plant shut down, followed by health problems, had left him unable to pay rent. In the blink of an eye, everything had crumbled. And now, each day on the street was a gamble. Sometimes, people tossed a few coins his way, but more often than not, they hurried past, avoiding his gaze as if he were invisible. On this particular morning, Leonard sat with a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps. God bless." His clothes, worn and thin, barely shielded him from the biting cold. He rubbed his hands together, trying to warm them, while the world around him continued on without so much as a glance. His mind wandered as he watched the shoes that passed by, polished loafers, high heels, and sneakers of every kind. But then, something caught his attention. A pair of pristine white sneakers stopped just a few feet away. These weren't just any shoes. They were the kind of shoes that only someone young, someone privileged would wear. Leonard squinted, trying to make out the person standing before him. The teenager was tall and composed, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of a sleek jacket. Leonard's curiosity was piqued, but what really stood out to him was the way the boy was standing. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't in a rush. He was standing still, observing the world around him with a calmness that felt almost out of place amidst the chaos of the street. Leonard hesitated. He wasn't used to talking to strangers unless they made eye contact first. But something about the teenager's demeanor made him feel like this was different. "Hey, young man," Leonard called out, forcing a weak smile, his voice hoarse from the cold. "Can you spare $1?" For a moment, the boy didn't move. He froze mid-scroll, his head tilting slightly, as if trying to process the request. Slowly, he turned to face Leonard. His expression was unreadable, but there was something about the way he held himself, calm, collected, that set him apart from the others who would have simply ignored Leonard and walked past. The boy's gaze seemed to pause the world around them, and Leonard, bracing for the usual rejection, wondered how he would respond. "What do you need it for?" The teenager asked, his voice calm but firm. The question took Leonard off guard. It wasn't dismissive or rude, but genuine curiosity, almost as if the boy really cared. Leonard, who wasn't used to being asked for an explanation, swallowed hard, suddenly unsure of what to say. He rubbed his hands together for warmth, trying to gather his thoughts. "A cup of coffee would be nice," he said slowly, his voice faltering. "Maybe a sandwich, if I'm lucky." He didn't expect much more than a brief exchange, but the way the teenager stood there, patiently listening, made him feel like this was different from every other interaction he'd had. As Leonard spoke, he could feel the eyes of others in the crowd on him, their judgment heavy and unspoken. He wanted to shrink away, to avoid the embarrassment, but the boy's gaze held him there. There was no contempt, no pity in those eyes, only something Leonard couldn't quite place, but it made him feel seen in a way that he hadn't felt in a long time. Then the boy spoke again. "What's your name?" Leonard hesitated before replying, his voice barely above a whisper. "Leonard?" he said, feeling the weight of the word. He hadn't introduced himself to anyone in months, and the act felt strange, almost foreign. The boy nodded, his brow furrowing as if he were processing something beyond just a simple name. "I'm Barron," the boy said, offering a quiet yet sincere introduction. There was no arrogance, no sense of entitlement, just a simple statement. The hum of the city returned, but something about this brief exchange felt different. The air between them seemed to charge with an energy that Leonard couldn't explain. This wasn't just a chance encounter. It was the beginning of something far bigger. Leonard shifted uneasily on the cold pavement, unsure how to respond. But Barron didn't seem in a hurry. He crouched down, lowering himself to Leonard's level. It was a simple gesture, but one that stopped Leonard in his tracks. Nobody ever did this. Nobody ever cared enough to get on eye level with him. "How long have you been out here?" Barron asked. His voice was calm but direct, a stark contrast to the hurried, dismissive tones Leonard was used to hearing. Leonard hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. Sharing his story wasn't something he did often. People didn't care about the reasons, only the spectacle of his misfortune. But there was something disarming about Barron's presence. Something that made Leonard feel like he could actually speak his truth. "Almost a year now," Leonard said, his voice low. "Lost my job when the plant shut down. Then my health took a turn. I couldn't keep up with rent. It's been downhill ever since." Barron listened intently, his gaze never leaving Leonard's face. It wasn't a look of judgment, but one of focus, like he was piecing together a puzzle in his mind. Leonard felt exposed, yet oddly comforted by the attention. He wasn't used to this level of care, and it stirred something in him, a long-buried sense of hope. As the crowd around them continued to whisper, Leonard could feel their curiosity, their stares, but Barron seemed unbothered, unaffected by the attention. "What about family?" Barron asked, breaking the silence. Leonard's throat tightened. Family. He hadn't thought about them in years. His parents were gone, and his relationship with his brother had crumbled long ago. The thought of family was almost too painful to address. "I don't have much of that anymore," Leonard replied, shaking his head. "My folks passed away years ago. My brother, well, we haven't talked in ages." He let out a bitter chuckle. "Not much left to lose when you've already lost it all." Barron was quiet for a moment, processing Leonard's words. The world around them seemed to fade as the teenager's gaze remained steady. Then, without warning, Barron reached into his jacket pocket. Leonard's heart skipped a beat. Had he really asked for just $1? Was Barron going to offer him more? Before Leonard could react, Barron pulled out a crisp $100 bill and handed it to him. "Here," Barron said, extending the bill toward him. "This should cover more than just coffee." Leonard stared at the money, unable to comprehend what was happening. He was used to small handouts, to the occasional coin thrown his way by strangers. But this was different. This was far beyond what he had ever imagined. "Are you serious?" Leonard asked, his voice trembling. "Why would you do that?" Barron shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Because I can." His words were simple, yet they carried a weight that Leonard could feel deep in his chest. But Barron wasn't done. "I don't want you to just take this money," he said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "I want you to promise something." Leonard blinked, unsure of what Barron was about to ask. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. "What's that?" Leonard asked, his grip tightening on the bill. Barron's eyes locked with his. "If I help you today, you've got to help yourself tomorrow." The words struck Leonard with an unexpected force. For the first time in as long as he could remember, someone wasn't just giving him a handout. They were challenging him, offering him a chance to reclaim something he thought he had lost forever, his dignity. "Deal," Leonard said, his voice thick with emotion. Barron nodded, a faint smile appearing on his face. "Good," he said, standing back up. "I'll be watching, Leonard." He glanced at the growing crowd, then back at Leonard. "You've got more strength in you than you realize." As Barron turned to leave, Leonard felt a mix of gratitude and disbelief. He looked down at the $100 bill in his hand, feeling its weight not just as money, but as a promise. A promise to change, to try, to believe that something better was possible. The next morning, Leonard found himself standing in front of a small diner, a place he hadn't stepped foot in for months. The familiar scent of coffee and eggs filled the air, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel completely out of place. He had walked into the diner, still holding the crisp $100 bill in his hand, unsure of how to spend it. He had promised Barron that he would help himself tomorrow, but what did that even mean? Where did he begin? As he entered the diner, the warmth from the heater hit him like a wave, and he took a deep breath, relishing the heat. A waitress with short blonde hair and a wide smile greeted him, clearly unfazed by the worn clothes he wore. "Morning, hon. What can I get for you?" Leonard stood frozen for a moment. His stomach churned with nerves. What did he want? What could he afford? "I'll have a coffee," he said finally, the words leaving his mouth without much thought. But then, as the waitress started to turn away, something inside him stirred. And a breakfast plate. Eggs, toast, and bacon. The waitress smiled and nodded, and Leonard felt a small sense of pride swell in his chest. He didn't know where this confidence had come from, but it was a new feeling. As he sat at the counter, he looked down at the $100 bill in his hand again. It seemed like so much money, more than he had seen in a long time. But Barron had asked him to help himself, to take a step forward. Was this the beginning? The idea of buying a meal, something so simple, felt like a small victory. As Leonard sipped his coffee, he began to think about his next steps. He could find work, even if it was just temporary. There had to be something, anything, he could do to get back on his feet. He'd heard about a few odd jobs here and there, people looking for help with moving or cleaning. Maybe he could do that. He just needed to find the courage to ask. The next few hours passed in a blur. Leonard left the diner with a full stomach and a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in months, he felt the sting of hopelessness begin to dull. Barron had given him not just money, but a glimpse of something more. A life beyond survival. A chance at something better. Leonard walked through the streets with a different posture, his steps more deliberate. He wasn't sure exactly where he was going, but he knew he had to move forward. Later that afternoon, Leonard found himself outside a local construction site, watching workers move heavy equipment. He didn't have the experience to operate any of the machines, but he knew he could do manual labor. He walked up to the foreman, a gruff man with a thick beard, and hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Excuse me, sir," Leonard said, his voice steady despite the nerves in his chest. "Are you hiring? I can do anything, carry, clean, whatever you need." The foreman looked him up and down, a skeptical eyebrow raised. "You're looking for work?" Leonard nodded, trying to meet the man's gaze. "Yes, sir. I'm not picky. I'll do whatever needs doing." The foreman scratched his chin, then looked around at the site. "Well, we could use an extra hand moving stuff around. I'll give you a chance, but you'd better keep up." Leonard didn't hesitate. "I will. Thank you." The next few weeks were a blur of hard work. Leonard's muscles ached in ways they hadn't in years, but every sore joint reminded him that he was alive, that he was moving forward. Barron's challenge echoed in his mind constantly. Help yourself. And Leonard was doing just that. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was building something, even if it was just his own dignity. As Leonard continued to work, he began to save a small portion of his earnings, always keeping Barron's words close to his heart. Every time he passed the diner, he remembered the day he'd sat there, uncertain and hungry. Now, with each paycheck, he felt a little more like himself, a little less like the man he had been on the street. The city had become less of a battleground and more of a place where he could start over. But despite his growing confidence, Leonard couldn't shake the feeling that Barron's presence in his life had been more than a coincidence. He hadn't seen him since that day on the street, but Leonard often found himself wondering what had prompted the teenager to help him. What kind of person had he been to care so much, to see Leonard not as a beggar, but as someone worth investing in? One evening, after a long shift, Leonard decided to walk back toward the corner where they had met. He wasn't sure why, but he needed to know if Barron would be there. As he approached, he saw someone standing by the same convenience store, the familiar white sneakers catching his eye. It was Barron. Leonard hesitated for a moment, then walked up to him, his heart racing. "Barron," he called out. Barron turned, a surprised but pleased expression crossing his face. "Leonard," he said, his tone warm. "I didn't expect to see you again." Leonard smiled, feeling a mix of gratitude and admiration. "I wanted to thank you for everything. You didn't just give me money that day. You gave me a chance." Barron's expression softened. "I didn't do it for a thank you," he said. "You did the hard part. I just gave you a push." Leonard nodded, understanding. "Still, it means a lot. I've been working. I'm saving up. Things are looking better. Barron smiled, his eyes gleaming with approval. I knew you had it in you. The two stood there for a moment, the street bustling around them. But for Leonard, it felt like a quiet victory. Barron's quiet confidence in him had transformed his life, and now it was Leonard's turn to believe in himself. As Leonard continued to work, the promise he had made to Barron weighed heavily on him. He had kept his word. He had found work, regained some of his dignity, and started to build a new life. But deep down, he knew the real challenge was just beginning. How long could he keep this momentum going? What if the weight of his past caught up to him, dragging him back into the cycle of hopelessness? Leonard was no longer the man who begged on the streets, but he still felt the remnants of that person inside him. He often found himself haunted by the nights he spent alone, hungry and cold, the desperation that had once defined him. Now, as he looked at the small apartment he had managed to rent, he could see how far he had come, but he also saw how fragile his new life was. He couldn't help but worry. What if he lost this job? What if something happened that sent him spiraling back to where he had been? But then, every time these fears crept in, he remembered Barron's words, "Help yourself." It was a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight, that there were people in the world who cared, who saw something in him worth saving. That thought became his anchor, and whenever doubt began to cloud his mind, he would push forward, one step at a time. It wasn't easy. Some days, the work seemed endless, and Leonard often felt the weight of his past threatening to pull him back into old habits. But he kept going. He stayed disciplined, kept his eyes on the future, and reminded himself that every day was a chance to do better than the last. Weeks turned into months, and Leonard's life began to stabilize. He had built a routine, found a small community of people who respected him, and slowly but surely, he started to believe in the possibility of a different future. A future that Barron had given him a glimpse of that day on the street. But Leonard wasn't done yet. He still had more to prove, not just to the world, but to himself. Leonard had worked tirelessly for months, and his efforts were beginning to bear fruit. He had become a respected member of the construction crew, steadily earning more and proving his worth. Each day, he felt himself growing stronger, more confident in his abilities. Yet, despite the progress, a part of him still couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He had made it this far, but was this truly the life he had envisioned for himself? One late afternoon, as Leonard finished up on site, the foreman approached him. He was holding a piece of paper and looked like he had something important to say. "Leonard," the foreman began, his voice serious, "I've been meaning to talk to you. I've been impressed with your work ethic, and we're looking for someone to step into a supervisor role. The pay would be better, and you'd have more responsibilities, but I think you're ready for it." Leonard froze. The offer was unexpected. He had always viewed himself as just a worker, someone who had to earn his place from the ground up. But now, the possibility of stepping into a leadership role, of overseeing others, felt both exciting and terrifying. I don't know," Leonard stammered. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for the job." The foreman chuckled. "You're already doing most of the work. This would just be a step up. I've seen how you've handled things here. You've got the skills and the mindset. Just think about it." Leonard took the paper and looked it over. The pay was good, and the responsibility came with a new level of respect. But with that respect came pressure, something Leonard wasn't sure he was ready to handle. He had spent so long fighting to survive that the thought of managing others, of guiding a team, felt like an entirely different battle. That night, Leonard sat in his apartment, the offer on his table. He stared at it for what seemed like hours, weighing the pros and cons. On one hand, it would be a huge step forward, a chance to prove that he could do more than just survive. He could thrive. On the other hand, the risk of failure loomed large, and Leonard wasn't sure he was ready for that. But then a voice echoed in his mind, one he hadn't heard in a long time. Barron's voice. "Help yourself." Leonard remembered the teenager's words, and in that moment, he realized something. He had already come so far. Why stop now? Barron hadn't just given him money that day. He had given him the courage to keep going. The courage to reach for more, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. The next morning, Leonard made up his mind. He walked into the construction office, paper in hand, and approached the foreman. "I'll take the position," he said, his voice steady. The foreman grinned. "I knew you would. Welcome aboard, Leonard." With his new position as a supervisor, Leonard's life began to change in ways he hadn't anticipated. The pressure was immense, and the responsibilities weighed heavily on his shoulders. He was now responsible for a team of workers, each with their own personalities, skills, and challenges. At first, it felt like a dream come true. He was no longer just a worker. He was a leader. People looked to him for guidance, and for the first time in his life, Leonard felt a sense of power and control. But with that power came expectations. Leonard had always been someone who preferred to keep his head down, to avoid standing out. Now, he had to speak up, make decisions, and ensure that his team was working efficiently and safely. The pressure to perform was constant, and there were days when Leonard questioned if he was truly cut out for this role. One afternoon, disaster struck. One of the machines on site malfunctioned, causing a minor accident. No one was seriously hurt, but the incident left a few workers shaken and the project behind schedule. Leonard's heart raced as he rushed to assess the situation. He immediately took charge, directing the workers to safety, calling for medical attention, and working with the foreman to ensure the issue was resolved. Later that evening, as Leonard sat in his small apartment, his hands trembling, he reflected on the events of the day. It had been a close call, and he had felt the weight of responsibility more than ever. If something had gone wrong, if someone had been seriously injured, it would have been his fault. The thought terrified him. But as he sat there, he also realized something important. Despite the fear, despite the pressure, he had handled the situation. He had stayed calm, made decisions, and ensured the safety of his team. In that moment, Leonard understood that he was no longer the man who had begged on the streets. He had become someone capable of handling real responsibility. The following days were filled with long hours and hard work as Leonard helped to get the project back on track. But through it all, he felt a sense of pride that he hadn't experienced before. He was doing it. He was succeeding. Yet the fear never fully left. Leonard had come so far, but he still feared failure. He feared that one wrong move could send him back to where he had started, the streets, with nothing. But with each challenge, Leonard grew stronger. And as he stood on the construction site, looking at the work his team had accomplished, he realized that he was no longer just trying to survive. He was building a future. As Leonard's new life began to take shape, he couldn't ignore the lingering shadows of his past. Despite his success on the construction site and the respect he had earned from his peers, something still gnawed at him. His past, his time on the streets, felt like a constant weight on his shoulders. It was something he couldn't escape, something he couldn't outrun. One evening, as Leonard was walking home from work, he crossed paths with an old acquaintance from his past. It was a man named Carl, someone Leonard had known from his days of struggle. Carl had always been a rough character, a streetwise hustler who had a knack for getting by through less than legal means. "Leonard?" Carl called out, his voice rough but familiar. "Man, is that you?" Leonard froze. He hadn't seen Carl in years, not since he had left the streets behind. But hearing his voice now brought back memories of his old life, of the desperation, the fear, the constant struggle to survive. Carl grinned, stepping closer. "Look at you, man. You've cleaned up, got yourself a nice suit, some money in your pocket. How's life treating you these days?" Leonard hesitated, unsure how to respond. Part of him wanted to walk away, to distance himself from the past he had worked so hard to escape. But another part of him felt an unexpected urge to talk, to share the truth about his journey. It's been good," Leonard said, his voice quiet but firm. "I've been working. Got a good job now." Carl's smile faltered, and he eyed Leonard suspiciously. "A job? You the guy who used to hustle on the streets? What happened? You decide to go legit?" Leonard felt a pang of anger rise within him. "It's not like that, Carl. I've worked hard. I've changed." Carl shrugged. "I don't know, man. You're playing it safe now? You sure you're not missing out on something?" Leonard stood tall, his voice steady. "I'm not missing anything. I'm building something better, something real." Carl chuckled, shaking his head. "Well, you do you, man. But don't forget where you came from." Leonard watched as Carl walked away, a familiar feeling of unease settling in his chest. The past wasn't something he could easily leave behind. It would always be a part of him, a shadow that lingered in the corners of his mind. But as Leonard stood there, he realized something important. The past could shape him, but it didn't have to define him. He had come too far to let it pull him back into the darkness. With newfound resolve, Leonard turned and walked home, determined to continue building his future, one step at a time. Leonard's role as a supervisor grew more complex with each passing day. He had earned the trust and respect of his team, but the pressure was building. Every day, more was expected of him. More decisions, more oversight, more responsibility. He could feel the weight of it all bearing down on him, and while he had risen to the challenge so far, he couldn't help but wonder how long he could keep it up. One evening, as he was reviewing project blueprints, the phone rang. It was his foreman, Frank. "Leonard, I need you to come in tomorrow," Frank said, his voice tense. "There's an issue with the budget. It's bad. Really bad. We're running over, and if we don't figure something out, the entire project is going to fall behind schedule. And you know what that means, right? Cost overruns mean more pressure from the higher-ups." Leonard's stomach sank. He had been hoping to avoid this kind of situation, but it was clear now that he couldn't escape it. The stakes were higher than ever, and the fear of failure was beginning to creep back in. What if he couldn't fix it? What if his team lost confidence in him? What if the whole project collapsed? The next day, Leonard arrived at the site early, his mind racing. Frank was waiting for him in the office, a stack of financial reports spread out on the table. "We're short," Frank said, pointing to the figures. "A few thousand over budget. And there's no cushion left. If we don't find a way to save some money, we're going to have to explain this to the project owners. And that's never good." Leonard stared at the numbers. There was no easy fix here. Cuts would have to be made somewhere, either in manpower, equipment, or materials. But each decision would affect the team and the quality of the work. It was a no-win situation. After a long day of meetings and calculations, Leonard was left feeling drained. He had to make a decision soon, one that would impact not just the project, but his career. If he couldn't get a handle on this situation, the consequences could be disastrous. The pressure was immense, and Leonard was beginning to feel the walls closing in. As he walked home that evening, he thought back to his early days, the desperation he'd felt, the fear that had always followed him. It was the same fear now, but bigger. He was no longer just fighting to survive. He was fighting for something he had worked so hard to build. He couldn't let it slip away. But even with all his experience, the stakes felt different now. It wasn't just about getting by anymore. It was about proving to himself and everyone else that he was capable of handling the weight of his new life. The following morning, Leonard sat down with Frank to discuss his options. Frank had come up with a few ideas, but none of them felt right. Cutting back on materials would compromise the integrity of the work, and reducing the team's hours would damage morale. Leonard knew that whatever decision he made, it would have far-reaching consequences. But the longer he hesitated, the more the pressure built. Finally, Leonard made up his mind. He couldn't let fear control his choices. "I think I've got an idea," Leonard said, his voice steady. "It's risky, but it might work." Frank raised an eyebrow. "What are you thinking?" "We need to change the way we're managing the project. Instead of cutting back on the work, we can streamline the process. We'll bring in outside contractors for the more specialized tasks, saving on labor costs, and reallocate the budget to focus on the essential materials. It'll take some negotiating, but we can do it. If we play our cards right, we can finish on time and under budget." Frank was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing Leonard's plan. Then he nodded. "It's a bold move, but it just might work. Let's give it a shot." Leonard wasted no time. He called in the project's primary contractor and a few trusted subcontractors to discuss his idea. It was a difficult conversation, full of negotiations and tough decisions, but Leonard stood his ground. He had learned from his time on the streets that sometimes the best way to survive was to take risks and make bold moves. By the end of the day, they had worked out a new plan, one that, while risky, had the potential to save the project. Leonard felt a sense of relief wash over him, but it was quickly replaced by a nagging feeling. He had made his move, But would it be enough? The next few days were a whirlwind. Leonard worked tirelessly to coordinate the new plan, communicating with the team, managing the contractors, and ensuring that the work kept moving forward. There were moments of doubt, moments when it seemed like the plan might fall apart, but Leonard kept pushing. The fear never went away, but he had learned to work with it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the project was completed, on time and, most importantly, within budget. Leonard stood on the construction site, watching the final touches being made, feeling a mix of exhaustion and pride. He had done it. He had faced the pressure, the fear, and the uncertainty, and he had come out on top. But even as he celebrated, Leonard knew that this was just the beginning. There would always be more challenges ahead, but now he had the confidence to face them. The fear would always be there, but Leonard had learned that it didn't have to control him. He had learned to take risks, to make bold decisions, and to trust in himself. As Leonard settled into his newfound success, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The project was complete, and the praise from his superiors was well-deserved, but there was an emptiness inside him. The weight of his past, the hardships, the struggles, the constant fight for survival, still lingered, haunting him in quiet moments. One evening, after work, Leonard met up with Barron at a small cafe. They had kept in touch over the past few months, and while their relationship had remained friendly, Leonard hadn't shared much about the challenges he had faced in his new role. As they sat down, Barron noticed the wariness in Leonard's eyes. "You okay, man?" he asked, his voice concerned. Leonard smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, I'm good. Just thinking a lot, you know." Barron nodded. "I get it. You've been through a lot." Leonard paused, then leaned forward. "I don't know, Barron. I thought this would be the answer. I thought getting this position, getting this success, would make everything feel right. But it doesn't. It's like I'm still running, still chasing something I can't catch." Barron studied him for a moment. "You've come a long way, man. You've built something. But you can't outrun your past forever. It'll catch up with you eventually." Leonard looked down at his hands, his fingers tense. "I know. I just don't know how to let go of it. The fear, the doubt. It's like it's always there, holding me back." Barron's voice softened. "It's not about letting go of it, Leonard. It's about learning to live with it. You don't have to let the past control you. You can use it to drive you forward, but you can't let it define you." Leonard thought about Barron's words, feeling a sense of understanding settle in his chest. The past wasn't something he could erase, but maybe it didn't have to control him anymore. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to balance his past with his future. As he left the cafe that night, Leonard felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead would still be difficult, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face it. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something real. And that was enough. The days following Leonard's conversation with Barron felt like a slow awakening. He had always lived in the shadow of his past, fighting to outrun the ghosts that haunted him. But now, for the first time, he felt like he could see a way forward, a way to not just survive, but truly thrive. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be fast, but he had come to realize something crucial. Success wasn't just about reaching the top. It was about understanding who you were, where you came from, and learning to embrace that journey. Leonard continued to thrive in his position, pushing through the hard days and relishing the victories. But he was no longer consumed by the fear of failure, the fear of slipping back into the shadows. He had learned to accept that fear as part of the process, to move alongside it instead of trying to outrun it. Months passed, and Leonard found himself stepping into new challenges with confidence. His team grew stronger under his leadership, and the respect he had earned from his superiors deepened. He had found a rhythm, a balance between the demands of his work and his personal life that had once seemed impossible. One afternoon, he sat in his office, reviewing the final report for a major project he had just completed. The numbers were good, better than expected, in fact. But it was more than just the success that mattered. It was the way the team had pulled together, the way they had faced the impossible and come out on top. Leonard knew that this was his true victory. Just as he was finishing up, the door to his office opened, and Frank stepped in, a wide grin on his face. "You did it. Frank said, clapping him on the back. You really did it. The higher-ups are impressed, Leonard. They want to offer you something more. Leonard looked up, puzzled. More? What do you mean? They want you to take on a bigger role, a leadership position that oversees multiple projects. It's yours if you want it. Leonard sat back in his chair, taking in the news. For a moment, he was silent. This was the moment he had been working toward, the moment that would take him even further into the world he had always dreamed of. And yet, as he sat there, a strange sense of peace washed over him. He wasn't sure if it was the right time, or if he was ready, but he knew this much. It wasn't the title or the position that mattered. It was how he got there, the person he had become along the way. I'll take it, he said, his voice steady. But I want to do it my way. I want to build a team that works together, that's more than just a group of people doing a job. I want to make sure we're all growing, learning, and supporting each other. It's not just about finishing projects. It's about doing things the right way. Frank smiled, clearly impressed. I think you're more than ready, Leonard. You've earned it. That night, as Leonard left the office, he couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. It wasn't the achievement itself that filled him with pride, but the journey he had taken to get here. Every failure, every mistake, every moment of fear had led him to this point. And though he knew the road ahead would have its challenges, he was no longer running from his past. He was using it, shaping it into something that would guide him forward. He thought back to Barron's words. You can't outrun your past forever. It'll catch up with you eventually. But it doesn't have to define you. It can drive you, but it doesn't have to hold you back. Leonard had embraced that lesson fully. His past, with all its pain and struggles, had shaped him into the man he had become, and now he had the power to shape his own future. As Leonard stepped out into the cool evening air, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of it all lift. He was no longer defined by the fear that had once held him captive. He had earned his place, and now he was ready for whatever came next. This wasn't the end of his journey. It was only the beginning. And for the first time, Leonard understood that he was not just surviving, he was thriving. And that was enough. Leonard's story is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a journey from the weight of fear and doubt into the freedom of self-acceptance and growth. It's a reminder that true success isn't in the accolades or titles we accumulate, but in the courage to rise after every fall, to learn from our mistakes, and to remain true to ourselves, no matter where we've been. Each challenge Leonard faced, each setback he endured, became a stepping stone toward purpose. He discovered that the past wasn't something to run from, but a part of him to understand, embrace, and build upon. The road was far from smooth, but it was his, and in claiming it, he found not just peace, but power. As Leonard stepped into his new role, it was more than a professional milestone. It was a testament to his character, resilience, and unwavering commitment to leading with integrity. With newfound clarity and a heart full of purpose, Leonard knew one thing with certainty. His past no longer defined him. Instead, he was defined by the choices he made and the man he had become. And as he looked ahead, he saw not an ending, but a beginning. His journey had only just begun. Thank you for listening to this incredible story and for watching the video. If this story inspired you, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and hit that subscribe button for more amazing content. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that could change your perspective. See you in the next video.